Is the global economic environment helping or hindering Australian fintech sector growth? And to do that, Cheryl Murphy, the EY Oceania Chief Economist, will join us for her presentation. Cheryl helps clients to understand and interpret the economic background. She uses her commercial acumen, public sector experience and analytic skills to see through the noise, giving clients timely insights and to identify risks and opportunities that are changing phases of the business cycle. Cheryl publishes regularly and is a trusted advisor in economic and policy issues for both domestic and international clients and stakeholders. Prior to EY, she was the Chief Economist at Austrade, helping guide the Australian Government policy in trade, foreign investment and tourism. She also spent 15 years at ANZ Bank, having started her career as an economic research analyst with the RBA. She also worked as a journalist at the AFR, which is when I first met her. She is a brilliant woman. Please put your hand together and welcome Cheryl Murphy.
Hello, good afternoon. Lovely to be here today. My job today, I guess, is to stand back a little bit and look at the global environment and particularly how it might affect the fintech sector. I'm not going to get into regulation because I don't know enough about it, but I am going to talk about the bigger picture issues that might be affecting the industry. So when I think about this, I can't help but go really big and start with the global economic trade environment, because there's been some problems recently. This is just, I guess, an indexation of both global trade and global GDP. And you can see that as of the global financial crisis around about 2008, that the two lines really started to diverge, with global trade in the pink falling right behind global GDP. So this is problematic because it means that we are, I guess, trading less relative to economic activity around the world. And that means that we're not getting the gains from trade, if you like, that we otherwise had been enjoying up to that point. Now, there's a number of consequences of that. Trade is beneficial for all of us. It lifts our standard of living, and it does make us all better off. It also is quite deflationary because a lot of the trade that takes place across the world is, of course, putting downward pressure on prices. And as you know, at the moment, with inflation a problem as it is, that can be problematic. So it's not something that we like to see happen. And I think probably what's the most concerning here is when you look at the last little bit of that chart, you can see that global GDP has taken off again and trade's gone the other way. And that's obviously to some extent related to COVID and the fact that supply chains started to break down in that period. But the other thing I'd also point to here is geopolitics. And as you know, there's a lot of tension around the world at the moment, and some particularly acute. These indexes are just taken from a group called Policy Uncertainty, and what they do is scrape news websites to get a sense of the types of terms that would indicate that there is geopolitical uncertainty in the world. Now, they're not perfect, but they are, I guess, a bit of an indicator of what's going on. And you can see that in the blue line in particular, obviously a spike at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, with that one picking up quite a lot. And then that pink line, the World Uncertainty Index, also kind of sloping up a little bit, again starting around about the time of the global financial crisis. I'd suggest that that is too a reason why global trade and GDP are not moving quite so in sync anymore, with people getting quite protectionist and worried about the consequences of linking their supply chains into other parts of the world. And of course, on the horizon, well, hopefully not on the horizon, but certainly bubbling away is the tensions between the US and China and the Taiwan situation. If anything, of course, that would suggest that we may even see further geopolitical unrest in the future. And again, it's something I think that we should all be thinking about, because there won't be a business in the world that's not affected by that if some tensions became more obvious and conflict broke out. There are, of course, humanitarian problems resulting from the extreme events that we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, and not for a second underplaying those. But if we were to focus on the economic consequences for the moment, they've been quite severe, as you know. Immediately, of course, what it did was increase energy prices. It increased global food prices as well, with a lot of global gas supply, oil, and wheat, barley, fertilizers coming out of the Ukraine or Russia. But I guess the most immediate problem is this incredible pickup in electricity prices in Europe, which is, of course, a result of some of the energy supply problems that we've seen. This is really alarming. I was at a presentation yesterday by Glenn Stevens, the former governor of the Reserve Bank, who said that this is definitely worse than the oil price crisis that we saw in the mid-1970s in terms of its impact on inflation. So this chart is just showing you what electricity prices have done through Europe and what futures are telling us. And at the moment, wholesale electricity prices are about 20 times what they were in Europe between the years of 2012 and 2020. 20 times, it's amazing. And then, of course, futures prices are suggesting that they'll actually go up substantially more. Now, again, this affects all of us because this effectively will, if these prices come through, throw Europe into recession. And it's something that will, again, it will touch a lot of the world. So it's a really unfortunate and very difficult environment. Policymakers in Europe, of course, now looking at stepping in and capping prices to actually make that market run more effectively. So the bottom line, I guess, for the global economy is that we are looking at something that's a lot softer in the coming financial year and probably the year after than we've just seen in the previous financial year. I've just taken a selection of the major areas around the world. Obviously, we can see quite clearly there the COVID dips, so the contraction in economies related specifically to the shutting down from COVID. And then we see this kind of big bounce back from a lower level. That was last financial year. The current financial year looks much slower, and it really doesn't matter what part of the world you look at. It's a fairly universal story. Perhaps China's the only one that didn't fall into recession, but of course a slowdown in China, even if it doesn't fall into recession, does again affect the whole world, given it's a trading partner or the largest trading partner for many countries. So it's going to be a harder 12 months, is what I'm saying, from a global economic point of view than it has been. And at the same time, and part of the reason, I guess, that is slower is because the global economy is dealing with this terrible inflation, which has arisen only over the last really 6 months. I've just taken the headline inflation numbers here from a number of economies, but I could have picked almost any economies in the world, and the picture is quite similar. We've had, from what was exceptionally low inflation in 2020 and 2021, something which has really risen up to multi-level highs, in some cases multi-decade highs actually, through the world. So obviously, a lot of things that are driving up inflation are in common. So again, global oil prices, food prices. There's not many of us that can avoid those two commodities. But there's also been an explosion of stimulus into the global economy from both fiscal authorities, so governments, and of course central banks, who during COVID put in place, I guess, more insurance than they might need to ensure that their economies were stable through the crisis. So it didn't really, all that sort of extra stimulus didn't have anywhere else to go. So what happened is, of course, it caused a price explosion, and that's what we're living through at the moment. Now, the central banks are now quickly trying to reverse that. And that's, of course, why we've seen them lifting interest rates quite sharply. It is not abnormal now to see 50 basis point rate hikes, as we well know, given having seen one on Tuesday. And I'm sorry about your mortgage, Simon. But, they certainly are reining things in really, really quickly. In Canada, they put in place a 1 percentage point increase in one meeting, which, again, we're just not used to that. But as you can see, and the reason I've put it on this big chart, sort of taking it back a long way, is that the movements are from an incredibly low base. And again, you know that during COVID, as I was saying before, the central banks are really trying to stimulate their economies and get things moving. So in other words, they're trying to get back to something closer to normal, something that doesn't overstimulate their economies. So this sounds like a pretty dreary scenario, and I do apologise for that. And you might think, well, why is that the case when yesterday we saw the national accounts in Australia and a 3.6% GDP growth in real terms, which is really pretty strong. And the truth is, it was strong, and Australia has performed exceptionally well last financial year. I think the question is, what does it look like next year? And I think that's where the challenges come in. So yes, we had a great economy. We had exports booming. The consumer was strong. Lots of stimulus in the economy, as we know, from the fiscal money, from the monetary policy stimulus with low interest rates. It all resulted in a really, really good set of numbers. But of course, that's nearly, 2.5 months ago, and a lot has changed since then. One of the problems with an economy running hot as it did last financial year is that it kind of hits its speed limit. This is just a measure of capacity utilisation. It's taken from the NAB business survey. And you can see that it's well and truly kind of at its most recent highs, and I actually think it might be a record high, so if we took the data back further. So what firms are saying is that basically they're using, if this is their kind of total capacity, they're getting closer and closer to the point where they can't produce anymore because they hit supply side constraints. And those supply side constraints may be capital equipment, they may be inputs, and of course they may be people. And so while having a strong economy is very good in a number of ways, and there's lots of demand in the economy, when your supply can't keep up, of course you get into all sorts of problems, including inflation. And one of the reasons, I guess, that at least in the last financial year, that we were doing so well is because of this terms of trade concept, the fact that our international pricing power was so good. Essentially, all that means is that our export prices was high. So as you know, coal prices were skyrocketing through the last financial year. Iron ore was doing pretty well, even though it's off its highs. LNG prices really strong. A lot of the agricultural production, of course, in the economy as well, has been enjoying really high prices there. I just wanted to contrast for you, and the point of this slide is to say that we are quite different from many other countries, many other developed countries, because we are a commodity exporter. So our terms of trade have been moving up, while as other economies like Japan and Germany, which are, of course, importers of these big commodities and the types of things that we sell, they've been going the other way. So Japan, Germany, its terms of trade falling. Even New Zealand, which again has enjoyed fairly good price rises for many of its agricultural production, has had a fairly flat terms of trade, certainly relative to ours. So Glenn Stevens twice I've quoted Glenn Stevens, but he once described the terms of trade as sort of a measure of how many television sets you could buy with a shipload of iron ore. So in other words, it's kind of like what you import versus what you export. So the fact that our terms of trade is high is really, really important, and it doesn't get nearly enough coverage, I don't think, in the media. This is why. So on the left-hand side, Australian exports, that's just the dollar value that we have been bringing in from our exports of various bulk commodities. The pink line there, which is coal, is probably the most extraordinary one, as you can see. But equally, when we look at the iron ore numbers in the green, also incredible. Remember that back in 2008, 9, 10, 11, we thought we were going through a commodity price boom? It's nothing on this. And of course, the other thing that's been happening since 2009 is that our exporters have been building up their capacity to export. So they've been obviously investing very, very heavily and increasing the ability to get stuff out the ground and ship it off. So in other words, they are raking it in right now, if I can put it subtly. We've seen now profits, and yesterday's data proved this, profits in the resources sector are now more than profits across the entire rest of the economy. So that one sector, which doesn't employ many people, keep in mind, is now making more money than the entire rest of the economy in Australia. So that's important, again, for a number of reasons. Obviously, there's a big skew here on where all the money's at, but it also is important for feeding money back into the system. So obviously there's dividends, there's employee wages, although they haven't actually gone up by very much. But the thing that is going up quite strongly is government tax revenue, because these big resource companies obviously now have a lot of tax obligations. I quite like this chart on the right. It just shows in the pink quite simply when during the COVID years, there was obviously a dip in the government's tax take, but look how quickly it's come back. This is monthly data from the Department of Finance, and that's all essentially money from the resources companies. So resource companies paying a lot of tax, which sounds great for the government, sounds great for the mining companies, but it's actually good for all of us, because what that then does is give the government a bit more freedom to A, pay off a bit of debt, B, recycle that money back through the economy. And that's kind of what we've seen. And again, I think this is a fact that's not particularly widely understood, but the Australian government sector at the moment now is spending about, in fact, more than $1 in every $4 in the Australian economy. So they're at 27% of GDP. That's state, federal and local government. And as you can see, particularly from the green line, which is government consumption, so things like spending on the NDIS, on hospitals, on even the flood relief would fit into that category. That is now sitting very high as a proportion of GDP compared to recent standards. So that is not a dollar figure, that is a proportion of GDP. In other words, I've kind of adjusted for what's going on in the rest of the economy. So lots of money going into, being spent by the government sector, taking it back a step because there's so much money coming in from the resources companies. There is also, of course, a lot of debt in here too. The pink line, the underlying public investment, things like roads, bridges, all the big major transport projects that we're seeing in Sydney and Melbourne in particular at the moment, is also quite high. So quite a lot of activity going on there too. So in other words, the government has cash and it is spending it, and it is quite an important influence on the economy right now. And when you think back to what I was saying before about the lack of resources in the economy because we're hitting our speed limits, it actually can be problematic. In other words, it does that crowding out, the so-called crowding out, where the government kind of is using up a lot of the economy's resources, and perhaps at the moment, arguably, it shouldn't be doing that. The labour market, of course, something that's of interest to all of us. I'm sure there's no one in this room that hasn't tried to find some staff and not been particularly successful. I've just sort of taken a number of job survey indicators from around the world and compared it to the number of unemployed people in those individual countries. Australia down the bottom left here, as you can see, very low. In other words, what it's suggesting is that there is less than one unemployed person per job vacancy at the moment in Australia. Now, I kind of thought, oh, well, this is kind of an Australian thing, we're doing better than most. But when we looked at the data from around the world, you could see that this was actually very common. So, in other words, the whole world is in the same dilemma. And it's quite easy to explain. Again, the world was overstimulated by monetary authorities and by fiscal authorities during COVID. There was an explosion in demand when lockdowns finished, and there was more demand than supply. All the unemployed workers got used up. People started moving around jobs, the Great Resignation, people getting paid more, etc. And the result is we now have extremely tight labour markets. And those tight labour markets, of course, means that companies have skills shortages. So in other words, we can't just kind of necessarily pull from a group of employees overseas or a group of talent overseas to fix our problems, because everyone else is trying to do the same thing to some extent. Having said that, the migration program is starting to pick up again, and we saw from the Jobs and Skills Summit last week that the Treasurer does intend to lift our migration program by 35,000 people, which is very welcome. It takes it to 195,000, and certainly it's not the kind of numbers that they probably won't achieve, although it could be a little challenging. But really, again, we're so far behind with our migration. We've had this enormous dip through COVID. We are a country that, of course, is used to having strong growth in migrants anyway, and so when you take that away, I guess we feel it more than most. The pickup has started. There has been more people coming back into the country, more students. You can see from the left-hand side that most of whom we lost actually were temporary visa holders, so it does tend to be students and the low-skilled, and that's, I guess, why the accommodation, food services industries have been, I guess, shouting quite loudly about this. So we will see a little bit of improvement there, but I think it's a while, as you can see from these charts, before we get back to something normal, particularly when the rest of the world is also crying out for skilled labour. I sort of wanted to see if there was a skew in the job vacancies and the demand across industries, but it is actually quite broad. So in other words, almost all industries have been crying out for more people. I've just circled professional services there. Technical services also fit into that category. And they're certainly not top of the list, like accommodation and food services, as I was suggesting, with the lower skilled and the students helping fill those jobs. But you can see that there is still a lot of vacancies there, and a lot of demand for labour in the professional services. So you probably want some good news. I don't have much, but I do have this one, which is that the global supply chains do actually look to be loosening up a bit now. We are starting to see some response to the extreme demand that we had for the movement of goods around the world. Of course, there's that movement of goods being accelerated by the fact that we weren't consuming services and we all wanted to, import outdoor furniture and the like from China. So we have started to see some of those come back as capacities come online and our consumption patterns return to something a bit more normal. In other words, we buy more services relative to goods. The Global Supply Chain Pressure Index on the right-hand side, that's just from the Fed Reserve, just kind of puts together a number of indicators. And then the Baltic Dry Index on the left is a shipping price indicator, which again just shows that even though we had sort of like a threefold increase in the cost of shipping our bulk commodities during 2020-21, that has now largely collapsed again. So these are certainly points of good news. So as I was saying, I think that we've had a really good 2020-21. I think that 2022-23 is definitely going to be harder, in part because we have central banks trying to pull in the extra demand to remove the inflation problem, or at least lessen the inflation problem. I think they've got a long way to go on that. We have the challenge of the fiscal money being kind of extracted as well. Governments have taken on a lot of debt around the world through the most recent period of trying to save their economies from COVID, and they're not going to be wanting to increase that pile of debt. So I think any fiscal money that we've been used to, of course, starts to slowly get extracted. These are demand side reasons why the economy won't grow as strongly. And importantly, of course, China's zero COVID policy will impact here too. So when that economy shuts down, or large parts of it shut down, of course, again, we see disruptions to supply chains, demand falling, and less movement of people around the world. So another reason that the demand side of the economy might look a bit softer in the coming year to 2 years ahead, and really who knows beyond that. This is something that I don't normally talk about because I've never had to talk about it in my entire career. But on the supply side, we now also have problems. As we know, as I've been talking about, geopolitical risk, sanctions, war, all of these things, again, they clog up supply, and they're terrible for so many reasons, but economically they cause big problems with supply, particularly when you knock out an economy which is a big supplier to the world and something as essential as energy. Again, I don't necessarily see the tensions there getting any better, so it becomes a problem for supply. Weaponization. If there's one thing that countries around the world right now are spending money on, it's various weapons, it's tanks, it's hardware. No, we might not want them to be spending money on that, but they are, and they're consuming resources, which takes it away from others. Part of the reason the Australian government spending is so high at the moment, it's defence. They don't talk about it, but it's taking up a lot of resources. Population ageing. Now, we've known about this one for a while. Of course, the fact that our population is ageing and we have workforces which are effectively shrinking relative to those that we have to support, either at the child end and the grandparent end. This is quite difficult to counter. It's hard to invent people, of course. It takes some time. So we will have that. The labour market shortages that we're experiencing now are probably not going to get a lot better. And the last one is, which is a whole topic in itself, and I'm sorry to just mention it briefly, but productivity growth. This is actually where we get a difference. This is how we can actually overcome some of these other problems. So you might not have as many people, so what do? You do better with what you do have. And that's productivity growth at its very core. So we need to see stronger productivity growth. It's been very sluggish for a long time. That's, of course, what the Jobs and Skills Summit was really about last week, was trying to get solutions to some of the problems that we have. And there's some, fantastic ideas out there from people much cleverer than me, and I'm going to leave that one for another day. But productivity growth, really, really important. So, what does it mean for the fintech sector? Well, I'm going to stick to the big picture stuff, as I said. If the fintech sector would like low inflation, low and predictable interest rates, well-functioning supply chains, talented employees, and healthy consumers, unfortunately, I think it's going to get a lot more challenging. So, in other words, of course, low inflation, we know we are seeing some elements of the supply chains ease up, and that's taking off some pressure from global prices, and some commodity prices are falling. Oil prices have fallen a little bit, as we know, so a little bit better there, but there's still a lot of domestic sources of inflation and still many problems related, in particular, as I was saying, back to the gas problems in Europe as well. Interest rates, as we know, are going up quite rapidly, and I don't think we're done yet. In other words, I think we've probably got at least another few months of rate hikes from the Reserve Bank and central banks around the world doing similar. Supply chains, as I said at the end there, we are actually seeing a little bit of easing up here as things normalise, and I suspect that that will continue, but it's not quite where it was, and it could take a little while to get back to that point. The world wants skilled employees. We know this. We know that that many corporations around the world are struggling with trying to find people, and I don't necessarily think that we have an incredibly good head start on a lot of other countries in attracting them. So this is going to be a real battle for people, I think, in the next few years as well. And then on the consumer front, actually things have been reasonably good. So we do have challenges for the consumer: falling real wages, really important, higher cost of living, and higher interest rates. But importantly, the strength of the labour markets, the fact that we do have a lot of demand for labour, and workforce participation rates are at record highs. In other words, there's more people now taking home a pay packet than ever before in Australia. That gives them a lot of purchasing power. And the fact that people have been saving, they've been really conservative through COVID, and now are in a fairly good financial position, means that I think consumption will hold up a little bit. So I will leave it there. I'm sorry I didn't have more good news, but wanted to end on a high point there.
Sherelle, do you have a second to answer any questions if our audience does? Yes, I knew there'd be some questions out of this one. And I do want to ask you, as I go up, the role of tech in productivity. It has been a big issue, a debate for a long time now. Yeah. How much can tech help in that productivity gain, in your view?
Yeah, a lot. It's an incredibly important part of the equation. It's interesting, though, Simon, that the research shows us that it's not just technological development, but of course it's how it's used. So when you've got, say, Apple kind of dominating over here, and that knowledge and IP not being shared or diffused through an economy, then you actually don't get nearly as many benefits as if it's actually kind of shared. So it's not just tech, but it's actually the way that it's managed, which obviously governments can do quite a lot about.
Thanks for the presentation, that was awesome. How have economists tried to balance, as you described at the end, that conservative money-saving attitude or behaviour of the economy of people, now post the pandemic, going, actually, I really want a holiday overseas, I really want to spend some of that money and enjoy my life, which is obviously affecting inflation, yet we're having hikes in mortgages when people just want to kind of have 6 months of living. It doesn't seem like that's been countered.
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? It's I do think there is pent-up demand, and we saw, as I say, we saw that yesterday. We could actually, this is not just a kind of a suggestion, we actually saw the consumption of or consumption at cafes, restaurants and takeaway food like bounced back very strongly. Transport consumption went up a lot, which essentially means airfares. So it is actually happening. Interestingly, if everyone took the money and went on an overseas holiday, it wouldn't create any inflation in Australia, but we don't really want them to take the money offshore necessarily altogether either. Look, the Reserve Bank is trying to do its part by, it probably doesn't feel like it's tapping on the brakes. It probably feels like it's slamming on the brakes at the moment. But we do have to remember that the cash rate is still only 2.35% at the moment. In other words, it's actually still quite low by historical standards. So they're just trying to slow things down a bit. I did the project during the week and I basically said, it's like a responsible parent taking away the beers at an 18th party at around about 11 p.m. So just before things get too hectic and the police get called, the Reserve Bank steps in, cools it down before the party gets shut down. That's my kind of analogy at the moment. So they're trying to slow things down without wrecking it, I guess. So we can still enjoy a holiday, but you can't enjoy a holiday and a bathroom renovation.
Any other questions? All good? Sherelle, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I just think it does set a little bit of the stage for the year ahead. Of course, there's always incredible opportunity in moments like this. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Sherelle Murphy from EY.